Good afternoon. It is great to be here. Really appreciate being invited to be a part of this. My name is Gabriella Celeste, and I'm with the Schubert Center for Child Studies here at Case Western Reserve University. And I first want to start by saying thank you so much to Dr. Rhonda Williams. I don't know where she went. I know she's running around here somewhere. What a terrific, there you are. And, you know, really, I'm honored to just get to be a part of this, but what an amazing panel this morning. I mean, thanks to all those panelists, and I have to confess, I'm really intimidated by all the, both the book knowledge and street knowledge and life knowledge in the room. So I'm just soaking it up. I'm just here soaking it up and happy to be here. I do want to, you know, this morning got me thinking about a few things, and since we're shy one panelist, we have just a little bit more time, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about, I want to share a story. We're here to talk this afternoon about educating for struggle in prisons. And, you know, we talked a lot came up this morning around slavery and where our country is when it comes to slavery, and Michelle Alexander's words in particular have been sort of ringing with me. And as being a lawyer, or a recovering lawyer, I haven't practiced in a while, I carry a pocket constitution with me. It's pretty worn. And I actually was pulling this out because, you know, how many of you all think that the, 13th Amendment got rid of slavery in our country? Well, good. We have an educated room. That's good. I'm going to read. It's a short amendment, but I think it's really important, right? Because 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1865, says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. Those are the words I want you to pay attention. Except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. So not only is, when we think about slavery and what the 13th Amendment did, we actually never got rid of slavery when it comes to prison. Never got rid of slavery when it comes to our criminal justice system. It sanctioned slavery, actually, under our own Constitution. And I would argue that it's not just in prison, and I think today we are thinking about a kind of expanded idea of prison. If I knock this off, let me know. Am I still on? But that it's not just those walls that we've built and put our kids and our parents and our aunties and our uncles and our grandparents behind, but it's what faces them coming back. And in fact, I would argue it's what we've built up as a society that almost inevitably pushes people toward those walls. And with that, I did want to share just a little bit, a short story of my own. And I'd love to say, you know, I've had my own personal awakening. I feel like every day is an awakening for me. I'm obviously on a journey of learning myself. But I used to represent, so I started off after law school. I had an amazing teacher in law school, a guy named Brian Stevenson, who runs Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. He's a death penalty lawyer. And he said, come down to Alabama. I want you to work with me. And I was privileged to get to spend a summer with him. And he said, you know, you need to actually spend time with my clients in prison. You don't need to learn from me. You need to spend time with my clients in prison. And I did that work for that summer, finished up law school. I'd spent actually my first time spending time in prison was in San Quentin before law school, and I was doing work with kids and their adult parents in prison. But all of that still didn't prepare me for when I spent my own time on the roads of Louisiana, driving up and down between New Orleans and Tallulah, which was the prison we were suing for conditions of confinement of the kids there. And I thought we were doing good work. I thought it was really important work. And every time I drive up that highway up north to Tallulah, I was always leaving feeling actually, while it was depressing and hard to see what we were subjecting our kids to every day, just inspired by how they could speak truth to power, what they did in that lawsuit. And I would feel humbled by them every time. But even that wasn't, and I was pissed off what we were doing to our kids and what our prisons, what we sort of had subjected them to, these kids who hadn't had a chance. But I will never forget the day I was leaving Tallulah early. And Tallulah, by the way, is a private prison, which we may get into today, too, here, sort of making profit on this. I was driving away, and I happened to be leaving early. It was mid-afternoon. And I'm driving back down toward New Orleans, and I must have passed this sign 50 times. And the sign, we don't call our prisons in Louisiana. Do you know what we call them? We call them farms, right? So we still put our people very much to work literally in the fields there. I passed this sign, and this sign says, prison farm. And it was the first time when I saw this sign, prison farm, with an arrow pointing to the right, and it pointed toward a road. But on the corner of that road, I actually saw something very different, which is a group of kids playing in a dusty schoolyard with virtually no playground to play in, a dilapidated school. And these group of kids, students, were playing in this yard. And I thought, that's our prison farm. It's not what it's pointing to down the road, which was, the correctional facility. We were planting seeds in that schoolyard every day by not giving those kids opportunity, by subjecting them to, frankly, a lifetime, it felt like, of not just poverty, but poor education, no access to health care, terrible housing, and their parents had no opportunity for jobs except to work in the prisons. So I could share a lot of numbers with you today, but I'll never forget that prison farm sign. And while Michelle Alexander says, we used to have the signs, she talks about the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow, and the difference being that we just don't have these signs that say whites only. Because so it makes it less maybe subtle, not so subtle, but we do have these signs everywhere, directly and indirectly. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be aware of both the obvious and not so obvious signs that are leading so many of our kids and our families into this system, which, as I said when I started, doesn't just cause, I feel like, in many ways, irreparable harm while they're there, but then they get labeled with a kind of scarlet letter. When we let them leave these facilities, but we won't hire them. We won't let them live somewhere. We won't let kids move back in with their own parents, or we're going to kick their parents out of where they are. We won't let them vote or participate on a jury. We've consigned them to, as again Michelle refers to, an undercast society. And I'm glad, though, we have people like Damien, who we'll hear from today, and others who are going to, I think, who are an important part of the voice of struggle and action for struggle to change what I see as a huge civil rights issue of our time. So I'll stop with my chatter because I know you're not here to hear me. We've got these fabulous panelists, and I'm going to turn it over in a moment. I want to just tell you kind of how I was thinking we do this today. Dan Berger, who's with us, will start off after I introduce him and talk about his important work as an author, an activist, and now professor. And then we'll have Damien Culvert also present. And finally, we'll end with Emmeline Liu, who's a student here at Case Western. We'll have a bit of a conversation. And I really want to open this up to you all, the audience, as we have a dialogue as we did this morning. So let me start by telling you a little about Daniel Berger. Dan comes to us currently by way of the University of Washington, in Bothell, at the University of Washington, where he's been now for the last year. He went there from Pennsylvania. Sorry, I'm going through the resume here. He's currently assistant professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington at Bothell. He's currently writing a book entitled Captive Nation, Black Prison Organizing During Civil Rights Era. That's to be published by the University of North Carolina Press in its new Justice, Power, and Politics series that Dr. Williams is involved in. He's also actually, there's another book that will be out next year called The Struggle Within Prisons, Political Prisoners and Mass Movements. So as I said to him, he's quite a prolific writer. He is also, though, an activist. He co-founded something called Decarcerate Pennsylvania to really take on mass incarceration and prisons in Pennsylvania, and that work continues and is quite active today. He's the grandson of Holocaust survivors and a longtime social activist. His writings on prisons, political prisoners, race, media, social movements, and other subjects have been published in many scholarly journals, popular magazines, and online forums. He serves now on the editorial board of The 60s, A Journey of History, Politics, and Culture. And I'd like to turn it over, if you will join me in welcoming Dan Berger.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle, and just want to reiterate the very heartfelt, strong thank you to Rhonda Williams and Shelley White and everyone who made this possible. It's really such a beautiful, wonderful gathering. I'm quite honored to be here. So what I'm going to try to do within my time frame today, right, is talk a little bit about some of the history that I've been researching and writing about for several years now, but also connect that to contemporary movements against not just mass incarceration, but the carceral state more broadly. And we'll talk some about that difference. And I'm going to ask for your help with something when I end. So my title today, sort of cheesy and cheeky as many of my titles are, is taken from an essay or borrowed from an essay by Huey Newton, right, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, who in 1970 wrote an essay called "Prison, Where is Thy Victory?" In which he said, right, in this essay written from prison, quote, "The prison cannot be victorious because walls, bars, and guards cannot conquer or hold down an idea." Right? And part of his assertion here, right, is that's exactly what prison tries to do, right? What prisons do in physically removing people and the kind of devastation that they wreak on communities, right, are about removing the difficult, dangerous ideas, right, as well as some of the people who hold them. And so what enabled this kind of bold stance, right, from Huey Newton is really 2 decades of organizing in prisons and around prisons connected to the civil rights and Black Power movement. So what I think of as a kind of prison movement in the decades after World War II, right, is deeply connected with the Black activism of that time period. So this is a picture of one of many such pictures of student demonstrators, right, filling the jail as part of the sit-ins during 1960. And what the civil rights movement, I think, did so profoundly was, embrace jail, right? Embrace going to jail with a strong sense of militancy and commitment, precisely because the jail and the prison, especially in the South, right, symbolized the worst of Jim Crow, right? The worst of white supremacy. And so by voluntarily, breaking the law and voluntarily going to jail, and for some people going to prison, was a way to protest and challenge and resist the larger structure of white supremacy that it represented, right? And then this continues with sort of added boldness, right, throughout the 60s and into the 70s. So this is a picture of George Jackson, right? How many people are familiar with George Jackson? I thought so, right? So a best-selling author from prison, someone who is at the center of my book, and someone who I think is whose influence comes both from his profound ability to explain and describe and analyze the role of prisons, right, in a kind of racist social and political system, but also someone who is very much an organizer inside, right? And so he was working to politicize people, right, to sort of challenge the segregation that was throughout the California prison system, while he's also, becoming a best-selling author. And that kind of combination of direct action and organizing with writing, I think, and cultural production generally, has been a hallmark of the prison as I think, an example of the larger Black freedom struggle, right? So in George Jackson, we get an example of moving from the inside to the outside, and the ways in which what was happening inside prison was influencing people on the outside, but it also goes both ways, right? Part of what makes the prison movement a movement is that connection from the outside to the inside, right? The ability for his words to circulate depends on people, willing to help him get those letters out and become books. But it also is incumbent on people coming together, right? And on the prison not being this sort of invisible space, right? I really loved what HQ said this morning, that we need to not confuse invisibility for absence, right? And that prisons work through invisibility, but that doesn't mean that they are an absent presence, right, or an absence in our lives. They're very much with us, right? So this is the kind of high tide of prison radicalism, or of a prison movement. And when Huey Newton wrote that the prison will not be victorious because it cannot conquer an idea, there were 300,000 people in prison, in jails across the United States, right? 300,000. Today, as I'm sure many of you know, there are 2.3 million people in prisons and jails, right? And that the US has not only the highest rate of incarceration in the world, but actually locks up the most numbers of people in the entire world, right? So the US is 5% of the world's population, but incarcerates 25% of the world's prison population, right? So just sort of think about that difference. It's quite astounding, right? And a kind of steady spike over 40 years, as we see here, right? And with particular devastating consequences, right, at the intersections of race and class. So this is a chart from the Pew Foundation. This is from 2008. But you see, right, for white people, 18 to 64, 1 in 87 is incarcerated. Right, for Black people in that context is, I'm sorry, this is men specifically. So 1 in 87 for white men age 18 to 64, 1 in 12 for Black men age 18 to 64, right? 1 in 9 for Black men age 20 to 34, and 1 in 3 for 20 to 34-year-old Black men without a high school diploma or GED. Right? So the deep kind of intersections between race and class, right, between the prison system and the school system and other kind of modes and forms of social reproduction are deep and profound, right? And I'm sorry, I was making this PowerPoint in a hurry, so I just have this one slide. But we could see similar disparities if we were looking at the incarceration rates of white women to Black women and Latina women as well, right? And this chart also doesn't include the massive and expanding carceral apparatus of immigrant detention, right? Which is, equally expansive and awful, right? So, okay. But what's happened in this change, right, is on the one hand a kind of massive expansion just in terms of whole numbers, the numbers of people in prison and the numbers of prisons that hold them, right? But that is a part of a larger, conceptual, ideological shift, right? That scholars like Beth Ritchie have called the prison nation, right? And that historians and others have taken to calling the carceral state. And that is to say that prisons have become so embedded within the United States over the last 40 plus years that we can't imagine something without them, right? So that we not only have more prisons than anywhere, but we have police officers in schools, right? We have police officers embedded within the remaining vestiges of a social welfare system. right? So that everything that accompanies imprisonment, right, about policing, about surveillance, about that kind of fear and intimidation becomes a part of what it means to live in the United States, right? And what it means to be an American is inseparable from the prison. Right, so that's the prison nation. So it's not just the kind of whole numbers, but it's the larger ways that to some extent the United States in the 21st century and the late 20th is kind of unimaginable without the prison, right? So that's the bad news, right? And that's the sort of difference from this is what sort of emerges in response to the civil rights and Black Power organizing that I started us with, right? But I also can't help but take hope, right? And want us to leave us with some kind of inspiration around this, because I think things are changing. I think the last 5 years of economic crisis have suddenly made things, the barrage of laws and steady carceral uptick represented in this chart is now up for debate in some level, right? In ways that it hasn't been since the end of the Panthers and the prison movement that they sort of came out of and contributed to. So I think we actually are in an organizing moment, right, where we can actually affect change at sort of levels unimaginable even just 5 years ago. So there's kind of 4 areas that I just want to quickly highlight for us. And I think we'll hear from several of them with Damien and Emmeline and I'm sure throughout the day. So one area is prison expansion, right? And here I want to include not just the fight to stop new prisons, but the fight to stop new jails, right? Because I think one of the things that's happened in as the high expense of prisons becomes more and more known, there's actually closing prisons is on the table, right? And closing prisons has happened in several states around the country, right? And Supreme Court orders to reduce the number of people in prison in California, right, are part of this larger effort. But in response, several states are trying to save money by just sort of shifting the burden to the counties. And so we're moving from prisons to jails, and we're still in the same basic problem. So part of these kind of campaigns against prison expansion include, I think, campaigns to stop the construction of new jails as well. So this is a picture from a demonstration that we had in Philadelphia a little over a year ago. That against prison expansion, as the state was trying to build 3 new prisons. And I think one of the things that we learned in the process of doing that work is that part of doing prisoner rights and prison organizing is actually learning a lot about how budgets work, right? And how does the state work? And things that seem in the abstract to be impossibly boring and sometimes even unnecessary. And yet, in those moments when ideas are up for debate, right, they become super important to know how budgets work because we can intervene in the process, right? So another kind of area of organizing that I think has been especially profound in the past few years is against solitary confinement, right? So as I'm sure many people here already know, there are about 80,000 people in solitary confinement units that go by a variety of names, some of them in whole prisons devoted to solitary confinement around the country, right? And long-term indefinite lockup without human contact. But this has also been an area where prisoner leadership and activism on the inside has been the most profound. So this is a picture in solidarity with the California prison hunger strikes, the first round of prisoner hunger strikes in 2011 that started at Pelican Bay, one of the most extreme prisons in the world. That men have spent decades in without any human contact, without sunlight. I mean, the conditions there are quite brutal. And without being able to physically be in the same room or access each other, men at Pelican Bay planned a hunger strike to protest their conditions that prisoners around the state of California adopted and took on, right? So they've since done 3 hunger strikes, and the most recent one had, at its height, 30,000 people participating. Right? 30,000 prisoners refusing food in protest of solitary confinement, and with a range of kind of demands that that you can read online, right? The Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity website. One of those hunger strikes in the past few years I just want to mention was here in Ohio, in Lucasville, from men on death row there. A third kind of major organizing area where we've seen a lot of work is around the restoration of civil and human rights of the formerly incarcerated and of the currently incarcerated, right? That these are related movements. And I know that Damien's going to talk a lot about that, so I won't spend time on it here, right? But this is just a picture of one of the main organizations of formerly incarcerated and convicted people's movement restaging the Selma to Montgomery March, right? As the sort of new civil rights movement, as the aspect of the civil rights movement that was sort of never acknowledged, right? The rights of current and former prisoners. And then finally, parole and sentencing reform, right? That so much of what's happened to send so many people to prison has been about changing the laws, right? Things that weren't considered criminal acts 50 years ago are now criminal acts. Things that were misdemeanors are now felonies, right? Things that were, a sort of shake of the finger are now sending you to prison and keeping you in prison, right? And there's a variety of efforts here that we could speak about. So what I think all of these kind of four areas point to is something called decarceration, right? So, and I think this is the strategy of contemporary prison organizing. This is what I want to argue the strategy is, one of decarceration as the response to mass incarceration, right? And so decarceration is both about, is about all four of the things I spoke about, right? So it's about having a moratorium on any new prisons, jails, detention centers, right? It's about promoting the policies that result in decarceration, right? That result in fewer people going to prison and people spending less time in prison. It's about the sort of budgets for humanity, as a group in California called CURB has put forward. And it's about community reinvestment, right? That all of the millions and billions of dollars that are spent on locking people up, thank you, should actually belong to our communities, right? And need to go back to our communities. They need to go to our schools. They need to go to our hospitals, right? They need to go to fresh food and food justice. I love the conversation that we were having about that yesterday. So this picture here is from a civil disobedience action that Decarcerate PA did to block construction of a new prison, right? Which we think is the first kind of civil disobedience on prison grounds that we know of. Right? And these are just some other examples from what's been happening in recent years. So there's a few things on decarceration that I was going to talk about, but I'm running short on time, so I'm going to skip them, but we can talk about them in the Q&A, right? But the three words that are up there are care, chronicle, coalesce. And what they all have in common is I think the work of prison organizing is to recognize that the prison is a part of everything, right? That the prison is not this far off place, this far off institution, but that the work that we're doing around our schools, around our workplaces, around the food that we do and don't have access to is totally embedded in, right, the carceral state. And so we need to recognize those connections and be able to sort of expand our organizing to see that along the way. So ultimately, what I think prison organizing is about, right, and the ways that we recognize that the prison is connected to everything, ultimately I think with a conversation that we're having is a conversation about freedom, right? So people often respond to sort of prisoner activism or the discussion of a kind of prison movement as if it's purely a kind of reactive, negative movement, right? That it's just about bad things in the world. But actually what I want to suggest is that the prison movement is one of the most prefigurative, right, and kind of visionary movements that exists, because it asks us to take seriously the question of freedom, right, and it asks us to take seriously the question of what it is we believe and how that relates with our own kind of capacities and visions of change. So I started off by saying that I was going to end by asking for your help, and I'm going to. I'd like us to kind of collectively read a poem by Assata Shakur, who I imagine is a familiar name to many of you, a former member of the Black Panther Party in New York, a political prisoner for several years until she escaped and was given exile in Cuba, where she remains. and who was the first woman to be placed on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list last year when they also put a $2 million bounty on her head. And Asada wrote this poem called Affirmation, right? And you'll notice in the poem that she doesn't mention prison once. And yet I think it is the encapsulation of what sort of prison movement is, right? Or what it means to talk about educating for struggle in prison and around prisons, right? So what I'm gonna ask of you all is to, when I point at you, to say, I believe, right? So can we just do that once? I believe. Okay, once to practice, I should have said. You're gonna do it many times. Okay, so here we go. I believe. In living, I believe. In the spectrum of beta days and gamma people, I believe. In sunshine, in windmills and waterfalls, tricycles and rocking chairs, and I believe. That seeds grow into sprouts and sprouts go into trees. I believe. In the magic of the hands and in the wisdom of the eyes, I believe. In rain and tears and in the blood of infinity. I believe. In life, and I have seen the death parade march through the torso of the earth, sculpting mud bodies in its path. I have seen the destruction of the daylight and seen bloodthirsty maggots prayed to and saluted. I have seen the kind become the blind and the blind become the bind in one easy lesson. I have walked on cut grass, I have eaten crow and blunderbread and breathed the stench of indifference. I have been locked by the lawless, handcuffed by the haters, gagged by the greedy. And if I know anything at all, it's that a wall is just a wall and nothing more at all. It can be broken down. I believe. In living, I believe. In birth, I believe. In the sweat of love and in the fire of truth, and I believe. That a lost ship steered by tired, seasick sailors can still be guided home to port. I'd like to ask for this last one to be the loudest one that you do. I believe. That we can end the, I'm sorry, man, I messed it up, a big conclusion. All right, this one is gonna be the biggest one. Here we go. I believe. In freedom and the abolition of the carceral state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. I'd like to introduce Damian Calvert. Damian was born and raised in Akron, Ohio, and has made Cleveland his home for the past 3 years. He's currently pursuing his Bachelor's of Science in Nonprofit Administration from Cleveland State University. In addition to holding that pursuing this current degree, Damon holds a number of collegiate-level program certificates in business, hospitality, retail administration from Ashland University. A returning citizen, Damian is a movement builder, organizer. Damian's story of self-narrative is drawn from his 18 and a half years of true life experience while living and serving time in prison. During his time incarcerated, Damian founded and was the inaugural president of the prison's NAACP chapter, became a certified American Red Cross instructor, served as management director of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, facilitated various educational workshops, mentored at-risk adolescents who came into the facility through the Heart-to-Heart program, and most notably wrote, proposed, and received authorization to facilitate the Reentry Premier program, which helped men prepare for successful transition back. Damian believes that we all tell stories in the way we live our lives, and that these stories can serve as tools to connect, to heal, and to transmit our truths in ways that add dignity and value to ourselves and our communities. Let's listen to Damian's story.
Permission from my elders to speak. Thank you, thank you. I learned early on that our futures are determined by who and what we choose to honor. So the fact that I'm here now, that I got this second chance, came from the wisdom that was shared with me from a lot of the elders who will never taste this side of the fence again. That for whatever reason, they saw a young, angry, light-skinned man seeking for identity inside the backdrop of a prison, and invested some life force in me and some wisdom that today is starting to take shape and blossom. So that's always important for me to honor them. And I'm gonna start off with a poem because you inspired me. But this poem is from the 19-year-old me that was in Lucasville in solitary confinement, where I did 13 months after stabbing my cellmate who tried to press me sexually. And it'll sort of set the tone for that feeling when we're talking about what it's like to be incarcerated or to carry the cross of a life sentence or a 10-year sentence or what have you. It's called Walls Talk. 4 walls staring back at me night and day. They seem to mock me. They're only to imprison me. Cold stone, cramped and dark. Trapped like sardines in a can. Stripped bare, a living dead man. Counting the years as depression slowly comes, like dark threatening clouds blotting out the sun. No way out, no hope for change. Called by number, never by name. Faith relinquished, tears suddenly flow. Heaviness of heart, head hung low. Silent screams of agony, never to be heard. Hopeless, surrender. 4 walls closing in, 4 walls always laughing as insanity grips the mind. Escape, the beginning of the end. A voice cries, death come quickly. I am here, it softly replies. Stillness, a relieving sigh. No more laughter, no more tears. Death's pardon, 4 walls disappear. Cold stone, no more my pain. Engraved with kind words, giving me back my name. I was 19 years old when I wrote that poem, and I was in a hole, solitary confinement, cell 2, K7, overflow at the time in Lucasville because they just had the riot a year before, and J-Side was destroyed. And I remember feeling like being in a hole within a hole within a hole. And it seemed like no light can get in that hole. And I felt disconnected from my own existence. And I remember this was a pivotal time for me because it could have went either way. I was feeling suicidal, but not in the sense of cutting my wrists, but in the angry sense of, I'm gonna go ahead and cuss one of these guards out and make them come in here and kill me. That was how I was thinking and feeling. And I remember the bitterness coming out of the other mouths of the men in other cells who cuss the guards out all day, who just holler outside their cells. And this became vivid to me when I was listening to Dan speak because he talked about solitary confinement and how that wreaks havoc on you psychologically from being disconnected from people. I once read a report called Abuses in Maximum Security Prisons where they talk about the sensory deprivation one suffers by being inside those boxes. And that there was a study conducted that professionals recognized that when you're incarcerated, the question is not, are you messed up? It's to what degree are you messed up, and how do we measure that? It's called PICS, post-incarcerated syndrome. That's characterized by malleus symptoms such as antisocial behavior, the ability to feel comfortable around crowds, able to get into a certain flow, so you become a recluse. All those things just came back up as I was listening to him to describe the prisons. Let's rewind 1 second. At 18, 1992, September 17th, I was sentenced 18 years of life for second-degree murder. I did it. But as I was sharing with Gabrielle earlier, I remember when the prosecutor was describing me and was calling me a murderer, calling me a juvenile delinquent, calling me a runaway, calling me a car thief, calling me a petty thief, and all these things, even bringing up my juvenile record, mind you, when I'm in adult court. I remember thinking like, she's speaking like she knows me. And I sort of detached from that and thinking like, okay, she called me a car thief, and like I was sharing with you, somebody taught me how to steal cars because I had ran away. When my mother was incarcerated at the age of 12, I ran away because some of those foster homes, they were just abusive. There was a lot of weird stuff going on in there. So I ran away. When they put me in Boys Village, I didn't know none of them people there. I ran away. When you put me in a monastery called Ephrata in Steubenville, Ohio, ran by a perv named Brother Andreas, I ran away. She didn't know that part of the story. When she's talking about I've been incarcerated in juvenile facilities, such as Buckeye Youth Center and Cargill Hills Boys School, she didn't understand that being on the run and being in the streets and, as they say, getting down like you live, that stuff weaponizes you. When she called me a murderer, she didn't realize that by the time I was 17, I was a father of 3 children, been shot 3 times, full-time hustler, and just a product of my environment. She didn't catch that piece of the story, you know. And so later on, while sitting in that hole, I remember thinking like, man, we have a tendency to look at where we fail as opposed to where we slip. Where do the slips happen? This forced me on a total different journey inside that hole, inside myself, inside my life. A journey that was more on the interior side. A journey that where I remember calling out to my God in every name I ever heard because I was dying in that hole, and I knew it. I knew I was on the precipice of some type of death. Either me, period, being destroyed, or that particular piece of me. I knew I was on the precipice of some type of death, though. And I remember calling out to God. I remember saying, you know, God, Jehovah, Jehovah Jireh, Adonai, Elohim, Allah, Krishna, Shiva, Parvati, all the names that I've ever heard, I threw them out there. I was just hoping one of them stick. And it was then that it was a slow process. It took me 18 and a half years to demonstrate my redeemability, but a process was birthed. A process was birthed, and I came out of that hole a different creature. I made it out of Lucasville. I made it to Lebanon. I made it to a lower security prison. And it was in that lower security prison that I became almost eligible to go to college. Because when Bill Clinton took away, you know, that new crime bill, the anti-crime legislation he passed back in '92, it took away all of our 94, took away our abilities to get a full education inside of prison. So I had to wait till I was 5 years to the parole board. But around that time, I started going to school. Around that time, I started looking differently at the men I was doing time with, because I realized when I see a macho brother walking around angry, there's a backstory. And that's when I began to understand we tell a story in the way we live our lives, and we hurting, and we bleeding, and we leaking life force, and we're looking for relevance, and we're looking for meaning. And I remember seeing some of the guys I knew connecting with their fathers. I started seeing this more often. A guy I'm working out with, a man looking at him with his mouth open, and I'm like, hey man, what this dude looking at you like that for? I didn't know if it's about to be trouble or what, and he gets up out his push-up position and look, and he was like, Dad? And I remember after the second time seeing that, I didn't know who my father was. I would look at a guy, I see him light-skinned, kind of buff, look like a solid character. I'd be like, man, what if, you know, just, would it be like to see my dad in here? And that hole that was missing in me. And I started getting involved in these programs, and I found something out, and it whetted my appetite for them. The programs became a vehicle not only for me to demonstrate my redeemability, but to transmit my consciousness, because I had learned a secret. When you demonstrate your consciousness to the people around you and to the powers that be, you're no longer a number or it or a thing. You become a name, and you become a force. And that was proven inside of there, because later on, after I consumed all the programs that they had, I started writing programs. And I remember one time as an example in Grafton Correctional Institution, after having established the NAACP there and serving as its charter president, a very tough guard named Barry Smith, who made it his business to lock somebody up every day. That was his business. He enjoyed it. After a program where I had spoke, he rides down on his bike, and I'm en route to my dorm, and he pulls in front of me, and I just stop and kind of lift my arms up, because I figure he gonna shake me down, seeing if I got any smuggling any of them cookies that they had at that event. And I know the routine. But he pulls up beside me, and he says, that was a good program, Calvert, and did this little neck thing, and he rolled off. That meant so much to me. He validated me, my humanity, my consciousness, and that I was doing something positive in there. And I wanted more of that. I wanted more of that. And so that was a point that I went into overdrive of trying to start programs in there, because I would see when former President Bush, one of the best things he ever did, the only piece of his legacy I would celebrate is the Second Chance Act, where he sent that money under the Second Chance to the faith-based community. And I see churches coming into the prisons all the time saying, hey, when you get out, we're going to teach you how to write a resume. We're going to do some interviewing skills with you. We're going to take you to Salvation Army, get you an interview suit, and you'll be good to go. And I remember thinking like, do that here. What you wait till you get out for? Matter of fact, come and instruct me. I'll teach you through my programs. And I can network, you know. And so I began reaching out in that way and ended up writing a reentry program. One of the things that I learned, I'm trying to summarize, one of the things I learned is there's this thing, it's called social entrepreneurship. This is what we have to be involved in. The prison industrial complex is making money. Reginald Wilkerson, one of our former directors of prison, sat on the Keefe board and the board to Access. One of the last acts he did as the director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections was stop and family members from being able to send clothes boxes and food boxes inside the prison, forcing you to have to buy it from the Keefe Corporation at elevated rates or buy TV, clothes from Access. By definition, these are monopolies. Wherever a prison comes into a community, it's a job stimulator there. Why are we not coming together to create jobs peripheral to this to address the men and women who will be coming out of prisons and our juveniles and putting life force and resources behind stopping our juveniles or stopping the young souls from making the mistakes we make? Why are we not hiring and putting resources behind those returned citizens who have demonstrated off of the merit of their conduct over the arc of their incarceration as evidenced by their jacket and what they've done and how they invested themselves? Why are we not putting resources behind them? These are questions I started thinking about. This is the counterpart to the organizing that we're talking about. This is the counterpiece to all of these businesses around prisons. Do you know that if you call Access and ask for one of their products, they'll be like, no, we only deal with people in prison. You won't get it because they still sell Pac-Man joysticks or stuff that they're giving to people in prison. Those who are just so disheartened by their condition, they busy themselves with distractions because it just hurt too much to look on self. Why are we not building business peripheral to this? This is where the investment should be coming from. This is work it proven. I'll share a brief story with you. A couple months ago, I went to a reentry symposium that was hosted up in Grafton Correctional Camp. And there was only 2 people there that was formerly incarcerated out of the close to maybe 400 people there, from the director of prisons to the regional directors, case managers, parole officers. My former parole officer was there, all these people. And they were lifting up what they were doing with the reentry reintegration units that they opened up in Grafton and Northeast Pre-Release Center and the like. And a lady stood up and says, well, I'm glad you're doing this, but where is your evidence? Are you operating off of evidence-based models? And where's your data? I haven't seen no data. And I heard one of the gentlemen I was sitting next to, who's a deputy warden, was like, damn, we just got up and running. I mean, we don't have no data, because normally they like to do it to 3 years. And I hear her, sometimes questions take the form of statements. So I stood up and I did a brief story of self about the programs and the impact it had on me, and how I was able to take my engagement from the programs and let it serve as raw material for my living resume. So that coming to prison at 18, where I never had a job, my only 2 skills was knowing how to steal cars, sell dope, and defend myself. Now here, my problem is trying to figure out how to get all my skill sets on one page through, my investments in these programs. Through my interpersonal communication skills, through me organizing fundraisers, through me facilitating workshops and the like. And I shared this with her. And then I turned her, I said, man, what is your name? She said, Monica. I said, Monica, I am your data. Out of that moment came an invitation from the unit manager administrator in Grafton for me to write a program and to come in there and run it. Toward that end, I've been through training in Trumbull Correctional Institution and Grafton to get my volunteers badge. Now I go in there unassisted. Why is this so important to me? Because at Grafton, I gave the last 11 years of my incarceration to that institution and left a legacy in there. And now I come back in there, and when I talk to a lot of the brothers in there, those of them that are respecters, that respect manhood and respect progress, they welcome me with open arms, and I get an investment and a level of engagement out of them that they can't get. because only those of us who've been bitten by the snake can tell each other how it feels. So those noble souls that's lifting up the issues in our community and that's bringing that academic qualification and that literary qualification, we have to partner with the ones who done lived it, breathed it, bled in it, who knows what it's like to carry that cross. Because again, only those of us who've been bitten by the snake can tell each other how it feels. Does it work? Yes. When I went up to the parole board 2006, they gave me 5 years. When I went back up at that 5 years, I knew in that time that I needed community support because I had fell into the habit of thinking I can do this by myself. I'm managing here. I don't want to be a burden on nobody. But when they gave me time, I remember them assessing me under the 8 domains of reentry, one of them familial social. They give you a risk score based off of do you get visits or not. And if you do not get visits, they interpret that as lack of community support. They track that. That lack of community support says to them that you are at a higher probability of recidivating. Therefore, you're less likely to be suitable for release. I got hit with that. So it was through the programs that I was able to network, to demonstrate my consciousness, to show my worthiness of investment, to write agencies that I'm from Akron, Ohio. I was working with Cleveland a lot because the men in my program were from Cuyahoga County or Elyria, Lorraine. Where I'm writing organizations say, if you invest in me, I would give you a couple of years of my life post-incarceration volunteer service. The people that run these organizations, the people like Mansfield Fraser, the people like Erica Ford, the people like Melissa Madeira, these are now friends. You know, so my ask of you is to get engaged. My ask of you is in church, when you don't got money to put in there, they say, hey, you can donate your time and your talents if you don't got the currency. That's something I get a lot of because I ain't got no money. Got plenty of life force, though. Get involved and let's invest in each other. And I can say so much more about this. Just ask me questions. We'll get on it because my time is up. Okay.
Thank you so much, Damon. We definitely will be asking questions. And we'd like to end the panel with Emmeline Liu. And I know that's a tough act to follow, Emmeline. Don't you worry. I think Emmeline represents, our future, too. She's a student here, currently a third-year student, an engineering student here at Case. We've, by the way, been named one of the top 10 nerdiest colleges here, so that's a good thing. And she has a strong interest, obviously, in social justice. She's the president of the New Abolitionist Association, which is a student group dedicated to dismantling the cradle-to-prison pipeline. And we are really happy to have you here, Emmeline, and would like to hear your thoughts as well. Okay.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Emmeline. Can you hear me? Okay. So yeah, as Gabrielle said, I am a third-year student studying systems and control engineering. I act as the president of the New Abolitionist Association here at Case. Unfortunately, we're currently on a hiatus as I attempted to take 19 credit hours and undertake graduate research and participate in a varsity sport. But previously, we have our mission statement is that we are dedicated to dismantling the cradle-to-prison pipeline, which, as you know, is the set of systematic disadvantages that disproportionately lead minorities to end up being incarcerated compared to any other ethnicity. And then so the way that we kind of do that, we want to, achieve that through direct action, whereas maybe some people some groups are more about fundraising or raising awareness. We try to actually go out into the community and do work that way. So some of the programs we've done in the past are we've held a workshop about confronting racism in conversation that was held as a Saturday, Case has Saturday days of activities known as SATCOs. So we held a workshop about racism conversation and just to have a kind of a space that we could actually discuss race and racism like in depth instead of just glossing it over. We also have held a cradle prison pipeline simulation. If anyone's ever participated in a poverty simulation here, we kind of modeled it off of that. So we had like 3 10-minute periods where we gave people profiles of like, this is your job, this is your family backgrounds, like this is your situation, and we also like gave out random cards to people to like kind of simulate what it's like, the randomness of life. I guess the most significant program that we implemented is we go to the Cuyahoga County Juvenile Justice Center, and this program was started. We started the ball rolling last fall, and then so the first step in this program was that we went to the Cuyahoga County Juvenile Justice Center just to tour it. And then this facility, I don't know if you have ever seen it, but it's down on Quincy Avenue, kind of in a weird location. It is like a shining, huge, it looks like a hotel, like resort area. Like, I'm not sure exactly what they were thinking when they were building this. It like was funded with the last of like the Jimmy DeMorris scandal money. I'm not originally from Cleveland, so I don't know exactly what that means, but that's what I've been told. But when you go into this facility, the entrance, it's like paved in marble. And then I've read articles that the front desk is like a custom built piece that costs $327,000 to make. And obviously that's money that they could have invested other places. And then so this facility was built to kind of deal with the overflow at the old facility, and it is structured, it is kind of like a half circle shape, and it has 7 pods, housing used between, I think, the age of like 13 to 18. There's 7 pods. One of them is for females. I think the typical duration of the stays there are only a couple weeks. Most of their crimes are like, I'm pretty sure, traffic offenses. They're not violent offenders. And then so the first time we went there was just like go on a tour of the facility to kind of like familiarize ourselves with like what was going on, because I mean, I don't really have any background in the incarceration system. Like, I'm studying engineering. Like, I don't really know. I like grew up in a really affluent like neighborhood. I didn't know what was going on. And then so we walk in, and then every single one of these pods has like multiple flat screen televisions, like really nice computers, like nicer computers than we probably have at this school. And so, like, they have pool tables, like foosball tables. The furniture like looks like, you know, futuristic. Everything looks really nice. And even like people talking to us were like telling us about how this facility is like so great at rehabilitation. It like all the money that they have is like being utilized very well. They even have like a kitchen that they're trying to bring in a chef to like teach incarcerated youth how to like cook and stuff like that. So I was like really fascinated, because I was like, oh, well, I mean, maybe all this money that they're spending on it's like actually doing good. But then, so our first program, actually talking to kids there, we didn't really know what they wanted out of us. So our plan was just go in to talk to them about like, well, what do you want us to do for you? Like, we don't really know what the best way to serve you is. And then so we kind of went in just with that question, like, what do you want out of us? So it was more of an open discussion. We talked to one pod that was 15 to 17-year-olds, and we like broke up into small groups, like all the volunteers, and just to like talk with groups of the kids. And we like went in saying like, well, we just want to like educate ourselves on you. And I know I was like terrified doing this. I like had no idea what to expect. And when I went in to give my presentation, I had written out my opening speech like in kind of like vague, like academic, clinical like words. I was like, yeah, because the, you know, cradle to prison pipeline is bad and stuff. So we want to help you. And then the volunteer facilitator there broke down what I was saying, and she said to them, like, look around you. Look at who is incarcerated here. What race is here? Why are you here? Why is this what's happening in society that you guys are here? What mistakes did you make, and what mistakes did society make that you have ended up here, and these students are trying to like talk that through with you. So like that kind of put me at ease, because I was like, that is what I was trying to say. Yes. So then when I went to like sat down and talked to these kids, I said, like, I just want to educate myself on, like, what are your problems? And they just laughed at me. They're like, what are our problems? Like, you want me to tell you about my problems? And I was like, yeah, like, I don't know what your life is. Like, just tell me about what's going on. Like, I'm only 3 years older than you. Like, you're my peer. And then, like, throughout the conversation, like, they started off just complaining about, like, how the food was bad, you know, like, what they said to us on the tour, like, was actually a lie. They're actually not allowed to touch the computers, not allowed to touch the foosball tables. They don't use the televisions. I mean, kind of, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. And then they eventually, like, the conversation kind of, like, went to, like, why are you even here? Like, why do you care about us? And I was like, you know what, like, I can't give you an exact answer, but to look at you and see, like, you are my peer. Like, you are only a couple years younger than me. Like, when I was your age, like, I dyed my hair blue, and, like, my best friend was arrested for, like, possession of marijuana. Like, I could have made the same mistakes as you. And so that's why I'm here, because, like, it doesn't make sense to me that, like, our nation is incarcerating and, like, marginalizing and segregating an entire population of people for no reason. And then so that kind of like opened up the conversation, because I was told, like, you're the only person who's ever showed any interest in my future, like, ever. And then to hear that as like a 19-year-old, like, I didn't do anything. Like, I drove down the road, I like filled out a volunteer application. That was like devastating to me. And then to like talk to these kids, like, one person said, like, you know, this is my second time here. The last time I was here, you know, I got out, I made all the calls, I called, like, a guidance counselor, I called the counselor, I called the probation officer, called all the people, like, what do I do to not end up in jail again? And then he said he did everything in his power. The people, like, tried to set up appointments with him. He, you know, like, followed through. No one showed up. None of them bothered to actually, like, try to help him. And then throughout the conversation with the other kids, they were like, someone said, like, me and my brother are both here. Our mother had a stroke. We had no idea what to do. Like, what were we supposed to do? Like, I'm 17, like, he's 14. What were we supposed to do? And, like, as volunteers, you're not allowed to ask, like, what was the crime that, like, made you end up here? But you can just imagine being 15 years old, your mother's in the hospital, and you have no idea what you're supposed to be doing with your life. And then talking to, like, the predominant theme that came out through the conversation was that, you know, my father's not in my life. Like, I'm in this facility. What does it mean to be a good person? No one in my entire life has ever taught me what it means to be good, what it means to be a man. And then I was just like, I don't know, like, I can't tell you, like, I don't know who's supposed to tell you, because they were saying, okay, I'm locked up right now, but what am I being taught right now is going to help me not end up here? I'm just locked up. Like, I have nothing. And then it's just like, exactly, like, what are you doing here? And then I know from, like, things that we learned through New Abolitionists and, like, from our fact sheets is that for juveniles, the recidivism rates actually are far lower if the courts just don't sentence the youth and just send them home to their families. And then, like, while we were also talking to these kids, someone wasn't allowed to, like, come out of his cell to talk to us because he misbehaved. And so someone started screaming and, like, flinging himself, like, against the walls of his cell. And then, like, all the boys I was talking to kind of, like, started laughing. And then all of a sudden they just stopped. And this one kid turned to me and he was like, you know, last week that kid was, like, flinging his shit against the window and we all thought it was really funny. But then why is that funny? Like, this kid is literally losing his mind. And we all thought that this was hilarious. But it's not. Like, no one's going to help him and, like, no one really cares. And that's just how it is. And so I, like, left that visit, like, kind of really shell-shocked because, like, I mean, this isn't my culture. Like, this isn't what I grew up with. But then, like, when it comes down to it, like, it has to be my culture because these, like I said to them, like, these are my peers. Like, these are the people that, like, in any other situation, like these are people I would be working with, that I have to work with, and then to just think of like how much resources and like time and money that we're wasting, you know, incarcerating children instead of like investing in education or investing in like helping them, like that just made me feel really sick. And then I know like we haven't been as involved this semester because I like decided that I didn't need to sleep. But it's just like weird to me to hear that like I'm the person who cares about them, you know, like what's going on in society, like what's going on with people, that this is what's happening. And I guess like I can have more to say later, but I guess that's all I have to say right now.
Thanks, Emmeline. So I'm taking in a lot here. I'm sure everyone is. I thought I'd start off with one question that everyone addressed a bit, and I appreciate each of you sharing your work and your stories. Part of how this whole industry maintains control is by keeping people out of sight. You know, this notion of out of sight, out of mind. And and this came up this morning too, you know, how do we make the invisible visible? How do we build solidarity both between and beyond with people, within those walls and beyond the walls? And I'd like each of you to maybe just share your thoughts about that to start, and then let's open it up for other questions. And these mics should be on, so whoever.
You want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've spent, a lot of my time thinking about that, and I started getting involved in prison work when I was in high school, and as a young activist, and looking for some sense of kind of mentorship, and who had been involved in struggle before, and could kind of give me some sense of what happened and what to do, what not to do, right, around activism generally. And not finding anyone in the suburbs where I grew up until I found lists of political prisoners, right? Mostly for former members of the Black Panthers and other kind of radical groups who were still in prison, and most of them. And so finally I had sort of names and addresses, and I started writing people. And so I think partly that contact, that connection, changed my life in a number of ways. And I think made prison visible to me, and ultimately made it, very kind of central part of my life. But the other thing I want to sort of would say about that is, so, that started when I was 16. I started writing people, and then I started visiting people when I was 19. And so I've been, many sort of prison visiting rooms ever since. And, just to be in like these prison towns is awful, right? Like the town is so economically devastated. And then the only thing that resembles an economy is this, monstrous institution, right? And so I, really just had always have a strong kind of personal, visceral reaction to being in any of these prison towns. But when we were starting Decarcerate PA, I had a really good conversation with someone from the California Prison Moratorium Project who said to me that nobody wants a prison, right? They may want jobs, right? They want safety. They want a number of things that sometimes they think the prison is going to give them, but nobody actually wants a prison. And so part of our job then is to bring that out, right? And is to surface that, and is to make that separation between what it is people actually want, right? And what the prison is actually going to do. And so I think part of the way that we sort of both make prisons visible, and that we kind of build that solidarity, right, is, first around having those kind of inside-out connections, and creating the opportunities for all of the many ways that prisons impact our communities to be clear and to be in the forefront. And then I think we also need to act from that position that nobody wants a prison, right? And so that means recognizing the ways that each and every one of us is impacted by mass incarceration and the carceral state, right? But we are impacted very differently by it. And that may seem like a sort of contradiction at some level, but I think it's only by holding on to both of those positions that each and every one of us has something to gain by dismantling the carceral state, and we are impacted differently in those ways, right, is the only way that I think we're going to actually do that.
Thanks, Dan. Damien, were you?
Yeah. First of all, I agree with a lot of what Dan said, but I'm gonna speak to it from a personal level too. As a man doing time inside the prison, I remember that desire to be seen. That's part of what pushed me into the programs, to be seen and to be acknowledged, because sometimes in those prisons, oftentimes you're forgotten. And for those of us that were doing long sentences, certain relationships or intimacies we once enjoyed, they just couldn't withstand the passing of so much time. And so you feel alone. Loved ones die, as what happened with my mother. And so there becomes a desire to be seen. On an individual level, that's why I gravitated toward the programs. Part of that is like, look at me, look at what can be done in here. And then as I matured in it, it's like, look at us, look at our condition, look at our potential. Where's the investment in us? And so one of the creative ways to do what Dan was talking about from the outside in, inside out, is there are a lot of organizations inside the prisons that are inmate-led, such as the NAACPs, the JCs, the Red Cross, VVA, and vets. As a side conversation, there are a lot of number of men who have served in Vietnam, who have served in Desert Storm, that are doing time. That in itself deserves attention. But they have all these different organizations in there, and to personalize your contact with them as just opposed to just coming through the institution trying to volunteer, come through the organizations and work with the organizations. As an NAACP president, when I fundraised, my fundraising was to pay stipends to get people inside the institution. Kent State University's African, their cultural department, especially during Black History Month, particularly during Hispanic Month, we're bringing programs in there. We call it edutainment. Let's educate while we entertain, get people there. This is a way to not only work with those organizations, but you really get your troops on the ground there, because they'll write you get the sense of what they need. If you have resources to bear, if you try to bring it through the institution, it gets diluted. You bring it through you bring it through the inmate organization, it's more concentrated and focused. So those are your entry points. I have a lot of people that's always like, hey, I'm interested in going inside the prison. One of the ways you get in is through the organizations. You can cut a lot of red tape if you establish relationship with those organizations and then help them create an event and invite you in on it. Then it's just a matter of getting you on the gate pass through that event and building those relationships. That's an entry point. That's just an entry point. There's so much more you can do, but it's about creatively engaging with those structures that's already in place and has that strong presence from the population in there. Mm-hmm. So you can really get in there on the front lines and in the trenches.
Do you want to add anything, Emmeline? Or
Well,
certainly what you talked about, your whole...
Well, I guess like the thing, is this okay? Well, I'm always like surprised that you actually, if you like think that you want to do something, like you can just do it. Like if you have an idea about something that you want to enact, like if you want to like make a program, if you want to be seen, if you want to make a difference, like you can kind of just do that. And I'm always surprised that like that's something you can just do as a person. Like when we as a group decided that we wanted to volunteer at the Juvenile Justice Center and like do this program that we thought was like a little bit subversive in like the manner that we were being so direct, it did like, but it ended up not mattering. Like you can just do that. And I guess like if you like realize something that you thought was a good idea, and maybe if it like previously it wasn't, I'm not really sure what I'm saying, but like if you happen upon an issue that you thought was invisible and you feel like you have a good idea that you can, make a difference about it, like you do have the power to just, actually try to make a difference. And that might sound really naive or like idealistic, but I'm still surprised that you can just do that.
Well, and one of the things I was just going to say, it struck me, when Dan shared these numbers, while it's, near over 2 million incarcerated, our correctional system actually has over 7 million people in our country under control, whether it's jails, probation, parole. So it's not, while the numbers are horrific in terms of, our citizens in prisons, it's really how do we make connections with people in our communities who are still bearing that brunt. I'm going to let Damien talk, and then I see a hand back here. We'll go over here.
I just wanted to ask something. This is really important. When I was watching from Grafton, President Obama running, I was keying in on narratives. There's a certain narratives that's going on. When I said that, we tell a story in the way we live our lives, there's a narrative as any of us, if you're a single black mother, there's an ongoing narrative of you. If you're a black man that did time, there's a narrative of you, And these narratives, they disadvantage us and handicap us. These are where the labels come out of. And I had noticed in prison, I was always trying, when I'm writing a proposal, to move away from saying inmates. I started saying residents or souls because of the power of words. And regardless of what religion you are in, if you read the Torah, if you read the Bible, if you read the Quran, creation wasn't thought into being, it was spoken. And there's a power of words. And so the narratives that they have of us, men and women who are in transition, young souls growing up looking for an identity, there has to be a concentration of reclaiming your narrative. In my bio, I talk about the story of self. This has been a very, very important tool for me because coming home, I had to tell my story. Somebody's gonna ask, what was you in prison for? What? I had to prepare myself for that conversation. And one of the things I recognized early on is not to shy away from it, because much to the chagrin of a lot of my peers while I'm at college, school, or wherever, I let it be known, oh yeah, I'm a returned citizen. I had that experience. They be like, why you always gotta say it, man? Because one, I'm an ambassador. We're trying to change the hearts and minds about what's possible with us and about who we are, first and foremost. Two, I don't want you to Google me and find out, and then you feel like I deceived you because I didn't say it. And three, because through my own narrative, hey, I had this experience, but this is what I learned. These are the positive enterprises I gave myself to. These are the lessons I've learned. These are how I applied those lessons. This is the impact that it has had. That's a different story. It's much more empowering. And I don't tell you what I value. You apprehend what I value through this narrative. And it's a much more beautiful conversation and dialogue between us. And so there needs to be investment in us reclaiming our narratives individually and collectively and renaming what this thing is. Because when I go to meetings and I listen to the parole board talk and how they use these words like we're trying to balance public safety. So we deal with old law inmates, those sentenced prior to 1996, they're still in prison. Even though they came out with a truth in sentencing law, that people with the same situated crimes, those under the old law are doing much longer because they got to keep parole board. So I listened to their narrative about balancing public safety and the suitability for release for these guys, and I'm like, well, I know these guys. Let's go look at their records. They go out to parole board the first time, you give them 6 years, they haven't been in no trouble, do the 6 years, come back. Why did you give them 10? What do you justify that on? And so there's a narrative, and we need to come up with a new narrative that addresses it, that is empowering individually, collectively, and around the struggle. And I say that because it's super important, because how we word it and the narrative, not only does it draw attention to the issues we're trying to lift up, it humanizes the men and women that's caught up in this riptide, and it pulls on the heartstring of the people that want to help but don't know how to engage. Gives them clarity on it, so this is like super important, and this is like also what I call a genesis point to beginning to see him.
Thank you. Back here, there was a gentleman back here, I believe, or maybe it was, sorry, yes, please.
My question has to do for Damien.
Do you mind standing up just so then we can sort of see, if it's not too much time.
My question has to do with for Dan and Damien is he was talking about the disconnect between being incarcerated and those who want to assist those who are incarcerated in terms of their particular experiences. How do you assess a real experience and make this particular connection? because it seems to me there are a number of different stereotypes and archetypes that are operating for those who have never went through those intimate experiences that I'm very familiar with. So many people who have not been through those experiences, it's a mountain for them to climb in terms of that. My second question has to do with mandatory minimum sentences. Oftentimes we have Rockefeller laws, street strikes laws, gang injunctions, and we also have specifications on top of a felony. We have many people who are, most people who are incarcerated are nonviolent offenders. With these specifications, these mandatory minimums, for example, Rockefeller laws, gang injunctions, or street strikes, how do you stem the tide of incarceration?
Well, thank you. I think, so we've got two questions. One, how do you make the connection between those who had the direct experience and those who want to be in solidarity and connect? And then this question about how do we really address mass incarceration when we have mandatory minimums and 3 strikes you're out laws? Who wants to take it?
I'll just go real
Okay.
briefly. I know Dan got some good stuff. But you personalize the connection. First of all, just real briefly, with a raising of hands, how many of you know somebody or has a family member or know somebody that's in prison? There's your connection right there. It's just a matter for us, even though we're caught up in the humdrum and busyness of our lives and the flow of our lives, stop and write a letter. I can't tell you how important a letter is on the inside. When somebody took time to sit there and write you a letter, and writing is a very archaic form now. I would never type letters from the outside. I always wrote them. Not that I didn't know how to type, but it's just something very intimate about a pen stroke. That's an art form that we lose it. And so it's already there. We got loved ones, family members, dads, moms, children, and juvenile. This is impacting all of us, so it is personal. And if you're community-minded or civic-minded, and we're always talking about the health, wellness, fitness, and vibrancy of our communities, it can be none of them until we address this population over here, particularly here in Cleveland, the biggest recipient of returned citizens every year. That's part of that social entrepreneurship, why I came home to Cleveland, and Cleveland is my home, even though I'm from Akron. So not only was I gone 18 and a half years, I come to foreign soil. But this is what opportunities are too, for value and dignity in this type of work. And so the connection's already there. It's a matter of us moving in. Now the question is how do we engage? A lot of you want to do it, but you just don't know how. And the ODRC is such a behemoth. You like, how do we throw stones at this Goliath? Without taking up all the time, some of the things I've been speaking about with this, first of all, reclaiming our narrative and framing this. In the Bible, it was always interesting how whenever there was a confrontation with a demon, before it can be exorcised, it had to be named. And they always reluctant to give their names. In psychology, when you're trying to help somebody, the first thing they have you do is name it so we could draw a circle around it. We got to name the problem. Not how they framing it, we got to frame our own problem in the naming, in the narrative. Now we know how to engage. Those are the points, and that's where we really need to talk about the how-to piece. But
Yeah. Well, I just really would echo that. I mean, I think the issue of sort of changing the narrative is so huge, right? And as an organizing principle, not just because it's the right thing to do, right? And so I think the kind of academic work goes a long way with it, but I think our ability to change the narrative rests on our sort of public, right, engagement and the ability to change the narrative in many publics. So the fact that almost every single person in the room raised their hand when Damien asked how many people have a friend or family member or loved one locked up, right, is devastating. But the fact that so many of us did that, right, is how we change the narrative when we raise our hand and offer that information in other spaces, right? Because I think that's what changes the narrative already. Everything about, prisoners and criminals and terrorists and everything that's sort of out there rests on the fact that every one of us who raised our hand isn't part of that story. Right? So our ability to tell the story about our friends and loved ones, right, and our own experiences in carceral institutions is about changing the narrative, and that's so important.
What about the piece, the policy piece?
Yeah,
I know we only have like 2 minutes left, and I want to get to one more question.
Okay, so I'll just say very quickly 2 things. One, Decarcerate PA, our slogan was build communities, not prisons. And we said that so much that we were sort of invited into the policy conversation, right? Because we could sort of shift the narrative in that way. The other thing is that, there's a lot of attention, as there should be, on how many nonviolent offenders get locked up. But I think it does us, a larger us, a disservice if we only focus on them, right? And I think there's actually a lot of strategic value and importance in talking about folks getting old and dying in prison, right? And not giving in to the existing sort of policy narrative about violent versus nonviolent offenders, but actually thinking about how do we get children out of the correctional system, how do we get older people out of the correctional system, and actually when we eliminate both sides of the spectrum, well, we'll end up with a lot fewer people in prison than if we just do the sort of mandatory minimum piece.
Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I want to commend you on what you're doing, and I'm really proud of the young man that came out and made use of what he could do to make an advancement for himself and also to reach back and help others that are in that situation. I'm a mother that has experienced the loss of a child through the penal system, and I just want to say today, it's a privatized prisons, it's free slave labor, and they're being incarcerated and taken away from their families and used on a new plantation called prison. And this is where the crux of the problem is. They're also taking them out of their communities, which gives the census a chance to give the community of the prison cities and the different places where they're being located, they get that money for it. So it's taken away from our city and our state and our community and putting our children into harm's way, put them in a place where they are obliged to do whatever they're told. And this is the corporations that are benefiting off the backs and the sweat and the blood of these people that would never get rehabilitated as long as they can use them for slave labor.
Thank you. I mean, I think this raises us, how do we take on the economics of the prison industry? And I know, Damien, you touched on that a bit. Do you want to say a real quick sort of thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, I don't know how to be quick, but I'll try to be as decisive
I'm
with
looking
it.
at Dr. Rhonda, making sure I'm okay on time.
But-
You got a few more minutes?
I mean,
2 minutes. Okay.
first of all, my condolences to that mother, first and foremost. And, when we look at the companies that deal with the prisons and how they go up on Capitol Hill and lobby and further add to this narrative of safety and therefore need to increase sentencing and all of that, again, there's a narrative. And I just see this, he mentioned about the policy, it's all on how you frame it and the narrative, how it pulls on the heartstrings of people. And one thing I learned, not just from story sharing, but listening to other stories, when I hear somebody facing the same challenges or similar challenge to me, the first thing it does to me when I listen with my heart is I feel less alone in what I'm going through. And to hear my story re-articulated in somebody else's story, I feel like there's a comrade here. There's a camaraderie here. We in the trenches together and there's mortar fire over us and it's like we looking at each other and we're like, we're still here. And like, wow, we surviving this together. And so in this sense, where we're doing the re-narrative and we're reclaiming this, right? And we're building businesses to attend to those folks that's trapped in this system. We're building business to address the needs of them. I see it as us, it's an old thing. If any of you that recognize and honor Kwanzaa, cooperative economics. It's a simple economic principle. First we need to stop dealing with them companies. We're helping to feed them. It's sad because they profit off of the pain and suffering on our need to remain connected to our loved ones through MCI, things like that. But we need to make certain sacrifices like we did during the bus stuff back in the 60s, because we need to stop funding these companies. We need to start funding each other. It's like, how do we do that? I know it's like a hard conversation to have, but listen. If we start making decisions with our pocketbook on where we're going to put our money and place it and start feeding that, it's going to start to shrink from it's going to get hungry and start to shrink.
Speaking of that, there's a, for those of you who don't know, Edwin's is a restaurant that's opening in Shaker and former.
It's open now.
It's open now. Okay, so formerly returning citizens and running the whole show. The whole
He
show
goes
there.
into the Grafton and trains them.
Put your money there if I'm allowed to advertise something. We are out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists. I think there's much more to say.